everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Outside Insider podcast here on Philly Sports Network with myself, Liam Jenkins. What a week it's been for the Philadelphia Eagles. Just when you think that there's been enough carnage caused now by a tornado or by the injury bug, it just sinks its teeth in a little bit more, doesn't it? It just digs it away. You know, you can't have a quiet week in Philadelphia sports. Even gritty wasn't the biggest story in Philadelphia sports. And if a mascot with googly eyes pouring popcorn over Rangers fans isn't the biggest thing in Philadelphia sports, then that kind of says a lot about this week. If this is your first time listening to the Outside Insider podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button in the description below. If you're on YouTube, hit it up the top, I suppose. But make sure you can get this podcast to your device absolutely free of charge, instantly, every single week, just by hitting that subscribe button. So if you like what you see, rate it 5 stars, hit subscribe. But we're going to dive straight in to something that obviously taken this fan base by storm. And there's been a massive debate this week, and I don't know where it's come from, or who's spinning it, or why. But before we get on to the injuries, before we talk about McLeod and the running backs and the future and what lies ahead, there's one man's name that for some reason keeps popping into discussions, and no one really knows why. And that man is, of course, Alshon Jeffery. The Eagles' number one wide receiver has been out since Super Bowl 52, with a torn rotator cuff having revealed that he played during the entire year with that injury. So just imagine, a torn rotator cuff, just in essence, doesn't sound like the nicest thing in the world, right? Imagine having to be an NFL wide receiver who puts up 789 receiving yards before then another 219 during 3 playoff games. Imagine having to lead that receiving corps with a torn rotator. Sure, as a receiver, your shoulders are quite important. A torn rotator cuff doesn't exactly sound great. So Jeffrey's been rehabbing the entire offseason, and all we've seen in the weeks leading back to his return, which should be the most exciting for Eagles fans, because this offense has been spluttering along. It's been inconsistent. Nick Foles wasn't exactly able to get the most out of a depleted receiving corps, and let's be honest, Carson Wentz's first game back, he was never really expected to get the most out of that receiving corps. Even the return of Jordan Matthews was always going to take some time, because working out of the slot, he was released from the New England Patriots due to a knee injury. He had to get reacclimated with the playbook, reacclimated with his surroundings, get himself physically healthy. He caught 2 passes for 21 yards. He was the only other wide receiver to make a catch against the Indianapolis Colts. So it's not like the Eagles have been firing at full force. What they've done a great job at is really utilising their other skill positions. The tight end, for instance, we know now that Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz put up 146 receiving yards between them. There's a film room video on this YouTube channel if you're watching on there. If not, head over to the Philly Sports Network YouTube channel to see exactly how Peterson used those tight ends. But you'd think that with Alshon Jeffery coming back, there'd be an overwhelming sense of excitement and pride in that this team is finally going to take a big step forward again. But no. Now, I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to draw attention to certain articles that I really don't think deserve the publicity, or to takes on Twitter that, again, shouldn't be takes on Twitter. But hey, everyone deserves their opinion. Everyone's got the right to say what they want to say. That's what makes America so great. The difference is that people are viewing Alshon Jeffery through a statistical lens and nothing else. Nothing else. And you can't look at a number one wide receiver like that, because their impact goes so far beyond what we see tracked on a stat sheet or tracked on Pro Football Focus. If you want to look at stats, we can say that Alshon Jeffery dropped 3 out of 72 catchable passes. In the second half of the season, he didn't drop 1. We can say he's a 6'3" wideout who makes 50-50 balls utterly competitive for a quarterback, but we're not going to look at that because people don't really care. They just focus on pure numbers. And even when we look at the pure numbers, we can still see a difference. Between 2016, when Carson Wentz had a receiving core of Jordan Matthews, struggling Nelson Aguilar, Dorial Green-Beckham, Paul Turner, Bryce Treggs, he averaged 6.23 yards per pass. That number rose to 7.49 with Jeffery being in the equation. But Liam, he wasn't targeting Jeffery all of that time. That number can't be representative. Well, fair point. But during that season, Carson Wentz targeted 223 times Zach Ertz and Jordan Matthews out of a total of 609 passes. 1.6 thousand, well, that sounded so British, 1,600 of their receiving yards came from those two. There were 3,700 altogether. 7 of the team's receiving touchdowns, of which there were 16, came from Ertz and Matthews. Now, the difference here is that although Alshon Jeffery is not elite, as some people like to say, that his presence alone opens up the rest of the field because he is simply too dangerous to be left alone. He may not be an Antonio Brown, which is somehow what people are now comparing him to, but the point is that at 6'3", as someone that can take the top off a defense, box out cornerbacks on curls and comebacks, and has the mental processing to diagnose the relationship between safeties and corners, dip between them, make his own decisions, and adjust for the quarterback to make a play, you can't leave him on his own. So if you're having to give Alshon Jeffery extra attention, then Nelson Aguilar in the middle gets a breath of fresh air. Zach Ertz gets some much needed fresh air, and all of a sudden, that wide receiver on the opposite side of the field looks a little bit more lethal. If you're focusing all your attention on the outside, well, then you expose yourself to being dominated on the ground. And that is the impact Alshon Jeffery has. Inside the red zone, the Eagles went from a pitiful 49% success rate in 2016 to a stunning league second best 64% in Jeffery's first year. Now, again, I'm not going to be that guy and say that's exactly the impact he has, but you can certainly see the correlation. So Jeffery's return isn't about the Eagles getting some elite receiver that is going to be spammed as if it was Madden 19, just hitting the X button over and over and over and over again on Hail Marys and 4 verticals until you get a completion. This is about taking the attention away from a quarterback on his second game back from a torn ACL, off a backfield that's depleted, a receiving corps that's depleted, and the two main targets who are Nelson Aguilar, who has taken on just about everything Wentz has thrown his way, and Zach Ertz, who is, at this point, the team's lone strong receiving threat, aside from Goddard and Aguilar. That's the impact that Alshon Jeffery has. And if you can't see that, if you're going to just go to ESPN, look at receiving yards and see Alshon Jeffery's not where he should be, then you're viewing it through the wrong lens. This Eagles team isn't one of individual brilliance. If you want them to be Oklahoma City, then go and watch the Pittsburgh Steelers. This isn't Russell Westbrook taking it over and over and over again. This is the Golden State Warriors, where if Steph Curry has an off night, Kevin Durant's going to punish you. If you need a bit more physicality, you've got one heck of a blocking tight end now in Dallas Goedert, or Draymond Green, sure, very different personalities. If neither of those guys can go, and you've got one of the most prolific shooters in the league in Klay Thompson, Nelson Aguilar. The whole point of the Warriors is they can sting you from so many different angles. It's not about selfishness or individual brilliance, it's about team success. We saw that last year. The Eagles spread that ball around so much it almost became hard to track at times. Alshon Jeffery is not a receiver that's going to see 20 targets a game. But the targets he does see are going to open up the offense. And that's all we're going to say. But again, if this is your first time listening to this podcast, make sure you subscribe down below. It'll be on iTunes and the Apple Podcast Store. We're going to have a very special guest on this week's podcast. He's going to be coming on the show in just a moment's time. I don't want to reveal too much just yet, but been waiting for quite some time to get him on as someone that was a massive fan of his work when I first discovered the Philadelphia Eagles and the NFL overall a few years ago now. So very excited to have a chat with him later on. Secondly though, before we get to that, there's obviously the elephant in the room, which is what happens now at the safety position. Think of the biggest companies in the world, or your favourite companies for that matter, brands that you're loyal to. There's probably going to be a lot of things that they have in common, but if you look at some of the most valuable, most marketable companies, places like Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, values that don't just sit at financial, but in terms of what they give to you. Same things with other brands like Samsung, with banks, fuel companies. Why do they get so much success and why are they so sustainable? The answer is because they're willing to adapt, they're willing to change, they're willing to take risks. And when things don't go their way, they overcome that adversity with a new, fresh look. Very similar to how it comes to sustaining a dynasty in professional sports. The Eagles will be no different. Losing Rodney McLeod to an injury that may not keep him out for the whole season, but at least is going to put a massive dent in their defensive secondary. What do they do now? How do they sustain this? How do they move forward? Well, luckily for Eagles fans, they're blessed with some of the most forward-thinking front office members in the league. Joe Douglas and Howie Roseman. They've got a head coach who is, again, very forward-thinking, embraces analytics. You've got a defensive coordinator that has rapidly become one of the best at what he does. If you are a globally recognised company and you go out and maybe have a bad year, maybe the turnover's not as great as you thought it was, you don't go out and just hire someone that hasn't got a job or someone that's not there or that shouldn't be an option, that wasn't an option before that month. You don't panic, throw away the blueprint of everything you're working on just to accommodate a slight dip. And that's what we're going to see with Rodney McLeod. A lot of people are hitting panic and, hammering down for the likes of Earl Thomas or for a trade or for someone such as like TJ Green to be signed to this team. But the Eagles already have enough depth. The signing of Corey Graham right now may be the most underrated off-season move of potentially the last few years. Because with Graham back, the Eagles actually have some optionality. If Corey Graham wasn't there, this would be a very different situation. But now you've got a few different ways this will go. Graham can captain that back line along with Malcolm Jenkins. If they do that way, Jenkins becomes a safety as he was in 2016, where he's almost pigeonholed to playing along that back line. Malcolm Jenkins has become this home-controlled remote missile that flies around the defense, making plays wherever Jim Schwartz sees fit. Without him being able to have that flexibility, it is no doubtedly going to put a strain on that defense once again, as it did in 2016. But Jenkins, along with Corey Graham, who's a veteran of this game, who's been playing with Jim Schwartz for countless years now, that's a great fit. They can get by with two, even without making any other adjustment. So then who would take over Malcolm's role? You've got someone such as Nate Jerry, the hybrid safety / linebacker coming out of Nebraska last year, who carved his way onto special teams and then earned splitting snaps with Kamagrugia Hill, that outside linebacker role where they now rotate depending on the matchup. So Jerry could very easily come in, fill in for Jenkins and leave Jenkins over the top with Corey Graham. You've also got, on that same vein, someone such as Rasul Douglas to move up top, someone like Avonte Maddox to fill that role. Just on the starting guys, you've got a lot of rotation that can take place without needing to even scratch the surface of what's available. You have players such as Trey Sullivan, who has spent time with the team last year, familiar with Joe Douglas from his time in Baltimore, has stuck onto the practice squad again in 2018 after almost kind of beating out Jeremy Reeves for a spot. It didn't quite go as intended, as Reeves now ends up with the Redskins, but nonetheless, a good showing. Sullivan has experience, he hits hard, he'll be a fit on this defense. Moving him up gives Jenkins that flexibility again. You've then, aside from that, got DeAndre Hall, a former 4th round pick in 2016, formerly, of course, of the Chicago Bears. He's now signed with the team he was traded for earlier in the year. They have optionality there. And with such a flurry of cornerbacks, I'm not going to hit the panic button again or drive you all over there, but I did a film room video saying that Rasul Douglas should be moved to safety, or at least they should be experimenting with snaps over the top. Maybe not full time, but they've definitely got the potential of the next Kurt Coleman level safety in Rasul Douglas. And that's a risk worth taking. Maybe not this stage in the year, maybe moving forward, but there is definitely potential there. So, again, you've got a defensive coordinator who is so good at creating a versatile atmosphere, at making sure every player is playing to their strengths and moulding around the scheme, why would they need to go out of their way to find extra help? It just doesn't make sense. They've got enough depth right now. They're not going to be clamouring on street corners trying to find a safety that went undrafted a couple of years ago and hasn't been able to stick onto a team outside of practice squads. They're not going to be giving up the house for a player that wants to be traded, and they're certainly not going to be compromising their already very tightly strapped cap situation. Don't panic. Rodney McLeod is a fantastic player. For me, one of the most important on that defense, considering that he kind of glues it all together, makes calls at the line of scrimmage and sets all that secondary up for success. But the Eagles can and will get by. They can and will find a way without needing to completely rewrite the script. And again, this comes back to Jordan Matthews, as I mentioned earlier on. Signed earlier in the week. Passed his physical, caught 2 passes. You can't just drop so, and that is someone that knew that scheme for the most part. That had spent 3 years with the Eagles, that knew the area, knew the city, knew the players, knew the team. Barely got any snaps. It would be the same for a new safety, only arguably more different because it's such a different transition. And it's the terminology. So even if you do bring in another name, now, the important thing to note is that the Eagles didn't work out anyone during the week. They aren't scrambling around desperately trying to replace Rodney McLeod, which tells me they're comfortable and confident enough, just as any company trying to sustain success through adversity would. But on that note, we're going to get to someone who is our special guest today, and I cannot wait to have this conversation. It has been a little while in the making. I've been a big fan of his work, as I said earlier in the show, since maybe 2014 when he was writing for Bleeding Green Nation. He went and covered the Jaguars for a while. He's now back on Philadelphia soil. Joining the show for the first time now, Mike Kaye of NJ.com. Mike, I've been trying to get you on the show for a while. The minute I heard you were back covering the Eagles again, it was on the top of my bucket list. It's great to have you on.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be on.
It's been a great story. I mean, the last few years, I remember when I first started following the Eagles, back in, it must have been 2013, I believe, that your work at Bleeding Green Nation at the time was, one of my main sources of getting that information on the other side of the pond. So I guess for yourself and your own career, having gone from working with Bleeding Green Nation, then obviously over to work with Jacksonville and back to the Eagles, I mean, I know you've only been back in Philly for a short while, but just how much has changed sort of around the team and the facility since you've been gone?
Well, it just seems like more of a, I covered the Eagles remotely. So for the most part, I was working through intermediaries or working, with independent sources in the building. But right now, being here and being around the beat, it's a welcoming feeling. It seems like this team is really a lot less hectic than it was during the Chip Kelly era. And clearly there's a sense of confidence because they're coming off the biggest win in franchise history. So overall, it's pretty low key. Guys are pretty approachable in the locker room. Everybody seems to be great.
Awesome to hear. Now, I think obviously your return to the Eagles media was meant to be, the biggest announcement of the week until Jordan Matthews also returns on the scene. So talking about, I guess the wide receiver picture and that sort of thing, there was, I think, a slight difference to how many people thought that would pan out. Matthews only tallied 2 receptions on the day. Moving forward, obviously Alshon Jeffery coming back into the fray soon. Is there still a need, do you think, to search for outside help, or has the emergence of tight ends really kind of calmed that down a little bit now?
Well, I think when you look at it, they've got 2 guys they can definitely count on in Nelson Aguilar and Alshon Jeffery when Jeffery returns to the lineup. And then they have a couple of unknown veterans who, not unknown veterans, but veterans that are kind of shaky. They've dealt with injuries in the past. They've dealt with drop-offs in production, Jordan Matthews and Kamar Aiken. But they've been around. They know what the league's like. They know the speed of the game. They understand that. And then they have Sheldon Gibson, who just can't seem to get on the field enough to make plays. He's only been targeted twice this year. I do think when everything settles in, they still need a guy to be a deep threat. Jordan Matthews isn't that guy. Kamar Aiken isn't that guy. Sheldon Gibson hasn't shown he can be that guy outside of film from his days in college. So I think that's something that they could look into, maybe around the trade deadline. Howie Roseman's very good about finding value elsewhere and winning trades, and I think that's a position to really keep in mind. I think the franchise is well aware of some of their shortcomings at the position. And, Nelson Aguilar has had to take the brunt of that. He's only averaging 7.3 yards per catch, but he's been targeted 27 times, which is 13 more targets than the entire rest of the wide receiver group. Even the guys that aren't on the team anymore have received. So he's getting a lot of attention. Still hasn't had a drop, though, in that production. He's one of, I believe, 12 wide receivers who've been targeted over 20 times and have yet to drop a pass, according to Pro Football Focus. So Aguilar's taking on the brunt. He needs the help from Jeffery. He needs the help from Zach Ertz.
Yeah, so Mike Kaye of NJ.com, at Mike_E_K on Twitter. I guess another thing with the wide receivers as well is that they've been looking for that deep threat for quite some time. You go back to 2016 and we had the failed, Bryce Treggs and Dorial Green-Beckham experiment. You get forward to 2017 and Torrey Smith comes in, but it's a little bit inconsistent. And then Mike Wallace was thought to be that initial upgrade, but still a stopgap. And they've still not been able to find that immediate sense of speed on the outside. Is it surprising that Shelton Gibson hasn't taken on that role after what was a really exciting preseason for him?
Yeah, I think Doug Peterson's a guy who's big on, if you practice well, you'll play well. And maybe he didn't necessarily show it in practice leading up to week 1 or week 2 or week 3. And, maybe maybe it's a little bit like Dallas Goedert where, he's barely used for a couple of games and then they unleash him because they have that card, in the back of their pocket. Gibson's a guy who is extremely talented. He showed during the preseason that the dropping the pass issues are far behind him. I think he's a guy that they want to hold off until the exact right moment to unleash. I think that's part of it. I also think part of it is he is an unknown, and so once you put him in that position to take on a bigger role, you don't know what you're going to get from him. But right now, Kamar Aiken and Jordan Matthews are not necessarily guys that are going to stretch the field, guys that are going to make big plays downfield and who you can target downfield in general.
Absolutely, and I guess another area of concern we really need to talk about quite urgently is going to be what happens at safety now after Rodney McLeod's injury. Still no certainty that he's going to be out for the year, but in terms of maybe a Jim Schwartz defense, what's the next move now? Do you move Malcolm Jenkins back up top, or are you looking at a guy like Trey Sullivan or DeAndre Hall?
I think you've got it in for the immediate future. We're talking on a Friday. They didn't, according to multiple league sources, they did not work out anyone on Monday or Tuesday. So chances are they're not going to bring in a guy that they've been able to look at for at least a week and make a decision on. So Trey Sullivan makes a lot of sense to bring up from the practice squad. He knows the defense. He's been around this team for 2 years. He's played on defense in the preseason and in training camp. Malcolm Jenkins was very complimentary of him as well on Thursday, saying that he feels like he's been able to call the defense and make adjustments with the first team during training camp and preseason this year. So from a knowledge standpoint, even though he only played 13 special team snaps in week 1, Trey Sullivan makes, a lot of sense. DeAndre Hall hasn't played a defensive snap for the Eagles ever in a game. So that's kind of questionable. He might still need some time to learn the playbook and everything. The Eagles could after this, they could take their lumps in this game with 2 inexperienced backups and then look towards the veteran free agent market, somebody like a TJ Ward or even somebody recognizable like Quentin Demps or Nate Allen, and kind of bring them in to be veteran depth. But right now, Corey Graham is going to hold down the free safety spot. And then you're kind of just looking at these 2 inexperienced backups who are probably going to see some playing time just because of how they like to move Corey Graham and Malcolm Jenkins around on a week-to-week basis.
I think the big wild card here with this McLeod injury is just how different he's played in 2018. If we think back to last year, he was very much along that back line and almost the anchor that allowed Jenkins to move around. This year you've seen him drop into the box a lot more and rush the passer and really get involved in some of these, wild Jim Schwartz experiments. What do the Eagles do from that standpoint? Is this where we could see someone like maybe Nate Jerry step up to the plate as that hybrid sort of guy?
That would be an interesting move. I think Avonte Maddox is a guy who probably deserves a little bit more playing time. Rasul Douglas is a guy who, whenever he's in there, makes a ton of plays. I could see them moving him in as the third safety. It's obviously, going to be a stretch for him to be able to be extremely effective in that role. But I think you move guys around because you have so much strength at the cornerback group. I mean, that might be against popular opinion, but I think Darby could be a Pro Bowler this year. I think while Jalen Mills has had some of his shortcomings, he's also played very, very well at times. And then, I think Sidney Jones is going to be the X factor here because people are going to target the middle of the field. People are going to target the slot with Rodney not being able to help. And, he's going to have to step up. Right now, he's been one of the better slot corners in the league. And so I think you're moving guys around. You're trying to figure out the game plan week to week and make it fit the strengths of your defense.
Yeah, and you wrote a really good article on Sidney Jones as well, just citing how impressive his play's been. Now, bearing in mind, obviously, that he was coming off what was essentially a redshirt rookie season, and he's only allowed, if I'm right in saying, is it 25 yards off the top of my head?
Yeah. I mean, he shut, according to Pro Football Focus, he shut down Mohamed Sanu to just 2 catches for 5 yards. That's pretty impressive. Sanu is one of the better slot receivers in the league. So, he's been impressive. A lot of people are pushing for him to move to the outside, but I think right now you're seeing he's been the guy that's been able to make up for Patrick Robinson's departure and also, set up the Eagles to where if they're attacking the boundaries, they've got to go against the top 2 corners on the team.
Yeah, and I think there's one of those, there's like a big misconception in the league that a nickel cornerback still isn't a starting role. But if you look at how many teams run a nickel defense, it's almost becoming a base defense around the league right now. So we look at the impact Robinson had last year. He was easily one of the most impressive defensive players on that team. There's no reason why Sidney Jones couldn't become the best corner in the league, for instance, from the slot and then move out from there. But in terms of I guess another area of weakness on the team, we've got to talk about running back, because although they were depth-stricken and the injury bug is sinking its teeth in deeper and deeper, Wendell Smallwood and Josh Adams held their own against the Indianapolis Colts. Is that something we could see against the Titans as well?
Well, I think Jay Ajayi is going to play on Sunday. Doug Peterson kind of alluded to that being almost a short thing, and I think he's a guy that, with the small fracture in his back, you're going to probably want to limit his carries to 12 to 15 a game. So I think that allows Wendell Smallwood and Corey Clement to have pretty large roles. I mean, I think Smallwood proved that he can shoulder some of the burden. Both he and Clement are pretty decent wide receivers. That's not really Ajayi's strength. So I think from a third down perspective, you're looking at Jay Ajayi sitting on the bench, and you're having Wendell Smallwood and Corey Clement clean up as receivers and blockers, because they're going to need Jay Ajayi to be at either full strength or in a comfortable position as they push towards the playoffs later in the season. So you don't want to overuse him. So I think Wendell Smallwood and Corey Clement are going to have bigger roles. Now, Josh Adams is going to be interesting. If they keep 4 guys active this week, Ajayi might not be the short yardage guy, and they might move Josh Adams into that role. And he's another long, big body who runs upright, but mocks kind of Ajayi style. And I think with that said, Josh Adams could get some carries as well.
And it's been a petition almost, I felt, for the last 3 years now that in the first round the Eagles should be targeting a running back. Even if you think back to when Carson Wentz wasn't an option, the Eagles were slowly climbing their way up that first round order, that there were always really impressive running backs available. And should the Eagles take that plunge, we're now into a position where this has very much almost been a foreshadowing, where there's no Darren Sproles, who of course is retiring at the end of the year. Jay Ajayi's in a contract year, and although as he's battled injury, may be looking for money elsewhere after signing with Drew Rosenhaus. I mean, what is the future of this running back position? Is it going to be the time that the Eagles finally invest in a running back in the draft, or is it just simply too soon to think about that right now?
I think right now it's a little too soon, but I do think you're looking at a day 2 pick. They should have probably drafted Alvin Kamara when they had the chance on day 2 a couple of years ago. But, I mean, the reality of the situation is they didn't. They're going to have to – I haven't really watched any tape on running backs this year, but they're going to have to invest at some point. I think they found a guy who can be their Brian Westbrook / their Terrell Buckhalter of the future in Corey Clement. I think they like him a lot. I think if Wendell Smallwood can continue to emerge, he's a good third down back, potential change of pace back. And then they just got to find that top guy. Could Josh Adams emerge? We've seen undrafted running backs emerge into starting Pro Bowl caliber running backs. They seem to like what they saw from him on Sunday against the Colts. Maybe it's that he's the guy that emerges and you feel a little bit better moving on from Ajayi and Sproles. But whatever Sproles can give you now is just an added throw in. And Ajayi with the back injury, you've got to make sure that you don't run him into the ground before he gets the opportunity to play in the playoffs. And maybe if this injury does hinder his production, it leads to him coming back on a 1-year deal.
Yeah, it's almost like a rock and a hard place, isn't it? It's depending where you want to sort of place that pendulum. But looking ahead to the next few weeks, obviously, from my perspective, we've got the Eagles in London, which is going to be a brilliant week. You've covered the Jags over the last few years, and the Jags have almost found a second home at Wembley now. What have you noticed,
Yep.
From being close with that team, the similarities between the Jags and the Eagles, or any major differences?
Well, I think with the Jaguars, they're a very underrated fan base. You have to be a diehard fan to be a Jaguars fan just because of all the national media hits that you take and how the jokes and how poked and prodded you all are. But I think the London-based fan has become very, very intelligent, or at least the UK-based fans have become very, very intelligent, very forward-thinking. They soak up every little bit they can about the sport. And I think people have gravitated towards the Jaguars because they're young, they're new, they're kind of brash. And from that perspective, when I went over to Wembley in 2016, there were a lot of Eagles fans there. People were excited about it. There's obviously a mix, you being there. Eagles fans, Bears fans, Seahawks fans, everybody, when you get to Wembley, is wearing different uniforms. So don't be shocked when you see 20 of the 32 teams probably represented in the stands. But I think the similarities is that both of these teams are young and exciting. They both have, relatable quarterbacks who are young and trying to grow as much as Blake Bortles has shade passed on him. And they both have really exciting defenses. And I think that's something that the UK audience has really gravitated towards.
Absolutely. In terms of, preparation for that week from a team perspective, I think from objectively what Jacksonville have done really well is that because they've made that trip so many times now that they know what to expect. They leave with plenty of time. They get all the sightseeing out of the way. It's just very much business trip, plenty of time to practice and get your body clocks adjusted. The teams that then come over maybe that first or second time still want to soak up the atmosphere a little bit. And you can kind of see the the fatigue a little bit from the flight setting in. If you were, in a way, going to advise the Eagles on what to do, would it be something like that, just to come maybe a few days earlier than expected, just to try and get yourself acquainted with the surroundings?
Yeah, I think showing up on Thursday or Friday is still appropriate, as long as you're giving yourself a couple of days. Teams typically have practice at a rugby field or a soccer field prior to the game on Friday, which I think is important. I think it's important to kind of get your legs under you, as it were. And yeah, like you said, the Jaguars have done a really good job of adjusting. They've tried several different plans of travel since they got that deal. And, the Eagles are going to have to find out on their own because everybody's different. There are some teams that want to land there on Saturday and then play the game Sunday, which is ridiculous, so I think it's a preferential thing. I think you have to feel it out on your own.
That's understandable. A more immediate concern is going to be the game this weekend against the Eagles quarterback that never was in Marcus Mariota. What are you going to be watching out for when the Eagles travel down to Nashville?
Well, can you contain Mariota in the pocket? You've got to make him throw. And when he's thrown as of late, the last season and 3 games, I guess you could call it, he has not thrown the ball well. He's made mistakes. He's caused turnovers. If he's on the run, he's fine. But, you've got to make sure that you're keeping him in the pocket, making him a pocket passer. And I think the Eagles have the talent to do that, especially with Michael Bennett and Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham and so on and so forth. So I think the Eagles have a good balance of defense against the Titans offense. The concern I have for the Eagles offense is this is the first 3-4 look they're going to see this year. And, they are missing Sproles. They could potentially miss Jeffery if this illness proves to be a thing. And, the lack of weapons for Carson Wentz is going to eventually catch up to this team. It's just, is this the week?
That's it. It's great stuff. So Mike Kaye from NJ.com. If you want to follow him on Twitter at Mike_E_K. A breath of fresh air, I should say, to the Philadelphia media once again. Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
There we go, guys. That's another episode of the Outside Insider in the books. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you like what you've heard today, make sure you subscribe down below on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. It would mean the world to me if you could. Let's really get this podcast rolling between now and London. What an episode it's been. A massive thank you to Mike Kaye of NJ.com again. If you want to follow him, Mike_E_K on Twitter. A fantastic follow for all things Eagles related. From myself, Liam Jenkins, we'll see you next time for another episode of The Outside Insider.